federal government had learned a hard lesson about cults 6 years previously. The Branch Davidian doomsday cult, or religious group, depending on who you ask, had been operating since 1955. But a split in the group in 1984 led to Vernon Wayne Howell leading a faction of 25 followers. Howell, who had sexual abuse allegations and statutory rape charges in the 60s, was even expelled from a church at 20 for his behavior. When he joined the Davidians in 1978, he allegedly seduced widowed leader Lois Roden by 1983, shortly before her death caused the divide. In 1989, when Howell's faction was living in the Mount Carmel property, Howell claimed God told him that he needed to father special people with the women of his group, and that their husbands should be celibate. The next year, he began assembling his army of God and changed his name to David Koresh. His right-hand men were Steve Schneider and attorney Douglas Wayne Martin. The Branch Davidians were involved with the local community of Waco because they performed legal trade at gun shows and owned a gun store called the Mag Bag. In May 1992, the Branch Davidian were discreetly reported to the ATF by a UPS driver who found grenades tumbling out of a broken container he was delivering to the compound. An investigation was underway by summer, with the ATF visiting the cult's gun dealer, triggering Koresh to extend an invitation to inspect their property for weapons, which was declined. Life on the compound would later be described thusly. His followers prepared themselves physically with weight training, military-style drills, and obstacle course runs. To acquaint them with the experience of famine, their vegetarian diet was strictly rationed. Daily life was a harsh mix of work and Bible study. Men labored at construction around the compound, while modestly dressed women did household chores and schooled the children, who were rarely taken off the grounds. Television was forbidden, and children's birthdays were never celebrated. In caustic monologues, Koresh would lead his zealots through the scripture in sessions that could last far into the night. To cover expenses, cult members donated their paychecks if they worked outside. Older members chipped in their social security checks and food stamps. On February 25, 1993, Special Agent David Aguilera issued an affidavit for an ATF raid via a search warrant at the Mount Carmel property on or before February 28th between 6 and 10 a.m. The day before that raid, the Waco Tribune-Herald published an expose alleging physical abuse, weapons stockpiling, statutory rape, and polygamy under the tyrannical instruction of Koresh. On the morning of the 28th, the Davidians were tipped off when a KWTX-TV news reporter asked Koresh's brother-in-law, a postal worker, for directions to the compound. When ATF kicked off the raid, it's unclear who fired the first shot, but Koresh ordered women and children to hide and men to pick up arms. Koresh was shot in the hand and stomach in the ensuing gunfire, while Wayne Martin called 911 and begged for law enforcement to stop shooting, saying amidst the sound of bullets, "That's them shooting, that's not us." 45 minutes into the shootout, ATF began running out of ammunition and asked for a ceasefire so they could retreat and evacuate their dead and wounded. 4 agents were dead and 16 were injured, while 5 Branch Davidians were dead. When allowed to leave by the Davidians, the FBI's hostage rescue team took command.
Many Waco residents had never heard of the Branch Davidians before today, despite the cult's existence here since the 1930s. Had you ever heard of this group before today?
No, I have not.
And how long have you lived in Waco?
All of my life.
Others were horrified by the news.
It's kind of unreal. I mean, you know, this being so close to Waco, and especially a cult.
It's scary.
A Waco Christian radio station had been receiving calls throughout the day from across the state. All they could do was try to calm callers' fears.
We're just trying to reassure them that the world's not falling apart. I mean, with what's happened in New York and just a couple of days ago and now here, and then bombings across the world overnight, it would sound as though the message of this cult is maybe bringing some reality to people that perhaps we're at the end of the world.
Outside communication was cut to the compound, and for the next 51 days, the FBI attempted to negotiate the group's surrender as the story became national news. Supporters and/or exploitative vendors convened on the area, including an angry young veteran selling bumper stickers named Timothy McVeigh. He was quoted as saying, "The government is afraid of the guns people have because they have to have control of the people at all times. Once you take away the guns, you can do anything to the people. You give them an inch and they take a mile. I believe we are slowly turning into a socialist government. The government is continually growing bigger and more powerful, and the people need to prepare to defend themselves against government control. The Davidians, meanwhile, hung a sheet saying, "Rodney King, we understand." Koresh agreed to let everyone leave peacefully if an audio message he recorded was broadcast nationally, but he reneged on that deal because he said God told him to wait. By March 6, 21 children between the ages of 5 months and 12 years old were released from the compound thanks to negotiators. They were reported to be well-mannered, smart, well-educated, and in remarkably good psychological condition. The FBI sent Koresh a camera, and he used it to show his underage wives and people saying they didn't want to leave. When negotiators got the video, they didn't want to release it because they feared Koresh would garner sympathy. As the siege dragged on, two factions within the FBI formed, taking the compound by force or continued negotiation. The FBI tried sleep deprivation via loud broadcasts and cutting the power and water, leaving the Davidians with one working water tank. As Koresh would go on long rants theorizing the end of the world and his role as a prophet, a biblical scholar consulted by the FBI suggested that Koresh's message could go far if he surrendered, comparing him to the Apostle Paul who wrote from prison. Koresh released 11 adults who were arrested as material witnesses. While Koresh repeatedly denied that he was planning mass suicide, religious scholars and psychoanalysts warned the FBI that their tactics would make the Branch Davidians more fanatic. On April 14th, Koresh sent a letter to his lawyer saying that he was writing an important religious document and would end the siege when his words were distributed. While the negotiation faction believed this was proof the siege would end peacefully, the force adherents advised Janet Reno that an assault was needed, allegedly due to falling conditions and the abuse of children. Additionally, the standoff was costing over $1 million a week.
Made such statements as, "We are ready for war. Let's get it on. Your talk is becoming in vain. I'm going to give you an opportunity to save yourself before you get blown away." He has indicated to us that he has sufficient firepower to blow up the Bradley vehicles, and in fact his words were, "We can cause those vehicles to go 40 or 50 feet into the air."
I want to talk to you, honey. Please hang out a banner and maybe I can see it if you hear me.
I know that David would like some legal counsel, and I hope that there's some way that he can get that message to us so that we can do something for him.
We're not a cult, we read the Bible. That's not a cult.
You'll have to back up. Koresh is coming out.
I think that it'd be pretty clear that were we not on the eve of Passover, that they'd be out by now.
We're not negotiating. We're saying come out. Come out with your hands up. This matter is over.
Clinton, to his credit, suggested continuing a peaceful blockade, but ultimately backed Reno's decision to mount an assault on the compound. On April 19th, around 6 a.m., the HRT broke holes into the compound's walls to pump in tear gas and force the group out. 6 hours passed without anybody leaving, and then 3 fires erupted around the compound as news cameras rolled. 76 people died, including 25 children and 26 believed to be mercy killings via gunshots, including Koresh. 9 people managed to escape. Surviving Branch Davidians, conspiracy theorists, and members of the right wing believed the FBI started the fires, while the federal government insisted that the Davidians had done so. By the way, one of the survivors included Douglas Wayne Martin's wife Sheila, whose 4 of 7 children died with their father in the compound. In the aftermath of the OKC bombing, the FBI and ATF's actions at Waco were cast into a new light, and by 1999 it was more common belief than not that the FBI started the fires. Reno had instructed the HRT to not use any pyrotechnic weapons, and the FBI swore under oath it didn't use any. But 3 flammable gas grenades were found in the rubble. Reno ordered an investigation under John C. Danforth, causing the FBI to admit in 1999 to using pyrotechnic rounds when firing at a water-filled construction pit, but not the building. While a Branch Davidian who escaped testified that the fire was set by the cult, and the eventual 2000 Danforth report provided evidence like accelerant on cultist clothing, recorded audio, and punctured fuel cans found at the scene, the FBI's poor decisions didn't go without scrutiny. Whether or not you believe the Branch Davidians were a cult, national media zeroed in on cult hysteria.
The apocalyptic ending at the Branch Davidian compound near Waco, Texas, has focused attention now more than ever on what some people say is an increasing number of dangerous cults in America. Not since Jonestown, where almost 1,000 followers died in a suicidal and murderous frenzy, have so many been sacrificed in the name of a charismatic cult leader.
Clearly, we've seen an increase in what we call cultic activity, along with an increase in generally speaking, sort of religious activity.
Some experts estimate there are about 30,000 followers of bona fide large cults in the United States and Canada. In fact, one of those feared to have been killed in the fire in Waco, Texas, was a Harvard-trained lawyer from St. Albans, Queens. His father is still an elder at the Seventh-day Adventist Church in Laurelton, but reportedly disapproved of his son following David Koresh. Today, the family was not available for comment. However, this woman will talk. She says she is a former member of what some call the biggest cult in America, Scientology.
What you're seeing here in Waco is the very end of the story. The beginning, they come off as very benevolent, having very benevolent world goals. They're not all religious in nature.
Cults brainwash their followers through these techniques: intense indoctrination, control of all information, destroy doubts before they can grow, reinforce fears such as God will punish you if you stray, and through public confessions where peer pressure and guilt leads to conformity. But is that enough for a mother to sacrifice her own child? It is believed about 17 children were lost in the fire near Waco.
The cult narrative helped the general public accept the results of the siege. The FBI changed its tactics going forward when dealing with aggravated cults and religious groups. It reported in 1999, defensive violence is utilized by cults to defend a compound or enclave that was created specifically to eliminate most contact with the dominant culture. The 1993 clash in Waco, Texas at the Branch Davidian complex is an illustration of such defensive violence. History has shown that groups that seek to withdraw from the dominant culture seldom act on their beliefs that the end time has come unless provoked. Of the 12 Branch Davidians charged with various felonies, none were convicted of murder of the ATF agents during the initial raid, though 8 were convicted on firearm charges and would be released by 2007. The head of the hostage rescue team had been Richard Rogers, who was in charge at another tragic event that also rattled the right wing back in 1992. In the early 80s, Randy and Vicki Weaver, who had made a comfortable living for themselves in Iowa, became entrenched in Christian fundamentalism, thanks in part to the 1978 doomsday book, The Late Great Planet Earth. Vicki, whose beliefs were fused with Orthodox interpretations of the Old Testament, convinced Randy that the apocalypse was approaching. So the self-proclaimed Israelites moved to Boundary County, Idaho, to build a cabin and live away from the evils of modern society. They were a part of a larger and loosely connected movement of white supremacists and religious fanatics following the Northwest Imperative, an ideology encouraging whites to resettle. Like the rest of their peers, the Weavers believed the American government was occupied by Zionists and were opposed to race mixing. Weaver also refused to pay taxes. In the mid to late 80s, the couple sporadically visited at nearby Hayden Lake, where Aryan nations held meetings. Weaver met an ATF informant and agreed to sell him illegally modified shotguns in 1989, garnering weapons charges the next year. Shortly before this, the family relocated to a cabin at Ruby Ridge. Randy was arrested in January 1991 when ATF agents posed as broken down motorists and the family stopped to help. Weaver was released on bail and told his trial would start in February. But there were communication errors and delayed letters to Randy from his probation officer, chiefly that he had been sent a letter with the wrong date. The Weavers didn't have a phone, so Randy didn't know his true appearance date. When he failed to show up, a bench warrant was issued, despite it being clear that he wasn't aware of his court date. For the next few months, Weaver was a fugitive, though he wasn't directly pursued and was known to be at his property, which was under surveillance. On April 18th, a helicopter for Geraldo Rivera's Now It Can Be Told TV show flew over the property, and it was falsely reported that the Weavers had shot at it. The U.S. Marshal Service unsuccessfully attempted to arrest Randy on August 21st. He refused to surrender himself, staying on the property with his 4 children, wife, and a family friend named Kevin Harris. As marshals walked around the property, they came upon Harris, Randy's 14-year-old son Sammy, and the family dog Stryker. Both Kevin and Sammy were armed, and after an exchange of gunfire, Stryker lay dead. Kevin killed a marshal, and as the pair retreated back towards the cabin, Sammy was shot in the back and killed. The property was surrounded by the Idaho State Police, and the FBI's hostage rescue team was deployed around 2:30 p.m. on August 22nd, and given the rules of engagement: deadly force against any adult male with a gun after the surrender announcement was made, citing in part the fake story that the Weavers shot at the Geraldo helicopter. The rules of engagement were controversial even among the snipers, who were in place around the property before negotiators arrived. On August 22nd, while going out to the shed to sit with the corpse of his son, Randy Weaver was shot in the back by sniper Lon Horiuchi. The sniper fired a second shot, which went through Kevin Harris and passed into Vicki Weaver. She was killed while holding the couple's 10-month-old daughter. Randy, Kevin, and the surviving daughters barricaded themselves in the cabin. Supporters were on the scene in the form of Aryan nations, neo-Nazis, paramilitary groups, and neighborly Idaho locals who, like the Weavers, didn't trust the federal government. That distrust was amplified on August 28th when the news was reported that Vicki Weaver had been killed. The FBI sent in the Weavers' radical friends, including neo-Nazi Richard Butler and militiaman and populist presidential wannabe Bo Gritz, to attempt to end the standoff peacefully. Harris, suffering from the gunshot wound he sustained, surrendered on Sunday, August 31st, and was evacuated to a hospital. The next day, Randy and his 16-year-old daughter Sarah surrendered, escorted from the cabin by a triumphant Bo Gritz, who gave a Nazi salute. Weaver was charged with multiple felonies and acquitted of all of them, except for missing his original court date and violating bail. He was given 18 months and fined $10,000. The 1994 DOJ report on the deadly siege, along with the Senate subcommittee, would find that the rules of engagement had been unconstitutional, and that the second shot that killed Vicki Weaver as she held her daughter did not constitute a legal use of deadly force.
On August 22nd, 1992, completely without warning of any kind, an FBI sniper shot and killed my wife, Vicki. He was using a .308 caliber sniper rifle with a specially weighted barrel and a 10-power scope. He was using match-grade ammunition. He had years of training to kill.
A 1997 attempt by Boundary County, Idaho, to prosecute sniper Lon Horiuchi failed. The Weaver family filed a wrongful death lawsuit for $200 million, with Randy ultimately getting $100,000 for himself and $1 million each for his 3 surviving daughters. In the aftermath of Ruby Ridge, sympathizers believed that any citizen could be a target of tyranny by the federal government. The black helicopters and concentration camps would be coming for a person's right to bear arms and seclude from society. Even among non-right-wing circles, Ruby Ridge was troubling. Wrote an anonymous opinion piece in the New York Times, Randy Weaver was a white supremacist. He lived as a heavily armed recluse in a cabin on a ridge in rural Idaho. Neither of those things is against the law in the United States. There are a lot of lunatics out there in the woods, but it is not the job of federal law enforcement agencies to behave in a way that seems designed to confirm their paranoia, especially when there is no proof they have violated any laws. In the months that followed the standoff, militias recruited new members, circulated propaganda, and stockpiled weapons. As Kathleeen Belew explored in Bring the War Home, the White Power Movement and Paramilitary America, Vicki Weaver was hagiographed as a model white woman who the movement had failed to protect. In the aftermath of Ruby Ridge, the most prominent threat against good white women was no longer men of color, who supremacists intentionally moved away from, but instead, the key enemy was the state. When federal troops had targeted dissident black people in Watts, anti-war protesters at Kent State, etc., that had been all right. Good for the country even. But the attack on white separatists? Unconscionable. Bo Gritz, riding a wave of publicity, called for more civilian militias. He and other leaders broadened their appeal by shifting from the Zionist-occupied government rhetoric of the 80s to fears about the New World Order. Once just targeting veterans and active-duty military personnel, militia leaders of the 90s also sought out skinheads. Before, skinheads had been repellent because they were usually not socially conservative and used drugs and alcohol. But in the 90s, their racist and anti-government views made them worthy of being courted. On October 23, 1992, a few weeks before the signing of the much-hated Brady handgun bill, 160 men gathered for the Rocky Mountain Rendezvous in Colorado to strategize a new militia. One of the attendees was William Pierce, who wrote the Turner Diaries. The rendezvous was organized by Pete Peters, who published The Bible, Handbook for Survivalists, Racists, Tax Protesters, Militants, and Right-Wing Extremists. In January, the militia of Montana was founded by John and David Trockman. John's wife Carolyn had brought food to the Weavers in the spring before the siege and helped Vicki deliver her baby. 800 people would gather in Kalispell, Montana to hear Trockman declare, "Gun control is people control." He'd go on to be a prime capitalist during the Y2K preparedness craze, which was closely related to the militia movement. As these armed civilian groups popped up across the country, conventions and instructional gatherings spread conspiracy theories about the implementation of martial law when the clock struck 12 in the new millennium. But more on that later. After Trockman's group formed, there was a split in the militia movement, with what one paper described as one side wants Americans to arm themselves against the government, the other side wants an armed citizenry to help the government. A spokesperson for the United States Militia Association rejected being lumped in with the new groups, who were deemed paranoid. The Waco Siege of '93 further added fuel to the militia fire, along with the '94 federal assault weapon ban. Not too long ago, it was unthinkable for federal agents wearing Nazi bucket helmets and black stormtrooper uniforms to attack law-abiding citizens. Not today. Read an NRA solicitation letter circa 1994. The next year, on April 13th, the NRA published a militia conspiracy theory that the government was out to kill law-abiding citizens and take their guns, causing George H.W. Bush to resign his membership publicly. The divergence between establishment Republicans like Bush and newcomers like the paranoid Helen Chenoweth of Idaho was never before so stark. In 1995, there were 224 militia groups in the U.S., and by the next year, these would peak at 858, with over 50,000 dues-paying members. And pointed out Belew, between 1992 and 1996, there were an estimated 25,000 hardcore white supremacists, 150 to 175,000 sympathizers, and an unknown amount of small cells. Cells, or unconnected groups or individuals operating below the radar and off the books of formal white supremacist entities and churches, were the right wing's greatest asset. Taking inspiration from the Turner Diaries, wrote Belew, operatives were expected to act on their own or in small groups in order to prevent leadership from being prosecuted and to limit the impact of government surveillance. One such cell, or lone wolf operative, was Timothy McVeigh. As a youth in Lockport, New York, he had grown up with guns given to him by his grandfather. He joined the Army in 1988 at 20 years old and served at Fort Benning, Georgia, where Terry Nichols was his platoon leader. When stationed in Kansas, the pair met a man named Michael Fortier. McVeigh served during Operation Desert Storm, where he was known among his peers for being an ardent racist. He also received a slew of medals for his wartime killings. During his time in Iraq, he was known for taking pictures of dead bodies, too. After failing to qualify for the Special Forces, McVeigh received an honorable discharge in 1991. Sometime after he would claim the military had put a microchip in his ass. He spent the next few years drifting around, having poor dating results with women, menial jobs, and increasingly becoming resentful of paying taxes. This worsened when he found out the government overpaid him $1,058 while in the Army and then demanded he pay the money back. Now listen, he ain't shit, but the government ain't shit for doing that. Like, for real. After Ruby Ridge, under the alias Tim Tuttle, McVeigh worked gun shows, traveling further and further west, where he'd pass out pamphlets with sniper Lon Horiuchi's personal information on it. He also sold copies of the Turner Diaries, which included a scene where the protagonists bomb a federal building in Washington, D.C., using a truck. In 1993, at the time of Waco, McVeigh lived on a farm in Michigan with Terry and James Nichols, where they experimented with bombs. The next year, in the wake of the federal assault weapons ban, McVeigh became more fanatical. Also, Nichols renounced his American citizenship via the tactic of severation by destroying his official documents. When rumors circulated that ammonium nitrate fertilizers would be banned, McVeigh and Nichols bought and sold the explosive in bulk to survivalists. By this time, they were already planning to commit an act of violence, even exploring the possibility of killing Janet Reno, who they blamed for Waco, and Horiuchi, who had murdered Vicki Weaver. They tried to convince their friend Michael Fortier to join in on their plans, but he declined. Instead of telling law enforcement, he told his wife, and she didn't go to law enforcement either. On April 19, 1995, McVeigh parked a rented truck in front of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City. The truck contained a bomb, assembled with help from Nichols. The federal building housed a Secret Service office and an ATF office. Importantly, the building had been the site of a failed bomb plot by a white supremacist group in the 80s. Not coincidentally, the same day that McVeigh parked the bomb in front of the building, a member of that same 1980s group, Richard Wayne Snell, was executed for murdering a black cop and a white man he believed to be Jewish. Before his execution, Snell chuckled that something significant was about to happen. As Belew tracked, McVeigh had numerous memberships and associations with separatist groups and leadership, including Elohim City, a camp in Oklahoma. Not only was Elohim City where Richard Snell's remains were released to, but by March 1995, a reliable female informant for the ATF at the camp reported that in the spring, federal buildings of Oklahoma or Texas were going to be targeted to trigger a racial holy war, coinciding with the commemoration of Waco. So on that fateful April morning, McVeigh detonated the bomb at 9:02 a.m. The truck's proximity to the second-floor daycare for children of federal employees meant that of the 168 people killed, 19 were minors.
The chaos in downtown Oklahoma City did indeed resemble Beirut after what police believe to be a 1,200-pound car bomb ripped through the 9-story federal building shortly after 9 o'clock this morning. More than 500 people were already in their offices, and at least 50 children were in a daycare center on the second floor.
A further 684 people were injured, and 300 buildings in the area were damaged from the force of the blast. McVeigh drove from the scene of the chaos in a yellow 77 Mercury Marquis without a license plate, gathering speculation that he wanted to be pulled over and caught, which he was on the same day.
The bombing in Oklahoma City was an attack on innocent children and defenseless citizens. It was an act of cowardice, and it was evil. The United States will not tolerate it, and I will not allow the people of this country to be intimidated.
The media and public faces of militia movements referred to McVeigh as a fringe lunatic, while hardcore racists like William Pierce, whose novel The Turner Diaries inspired the terrorism and informed cell-style organizing, applauded the bombing. McVeigh wanted to argue in court that his actions were justified because his life had been in imminent danger from the U.S. government. One paper described his legal strategy thusly. McVeigh, sporting a bright blue plaid shirt, listened intently in a courtroom packed with 150 people as his lawyer conceded to jurors that McVeigh was extremely upset over what he viewed as government abuses of individual liberty. It was no different from how millions of people fear and distrust the government. McVeigh was found guilty on all counts of murder and sentenced to death for the murders of the 8 federal officers. In addition to marveling that the federal government once celebrated him for killing Iraqis, he spent the rest of the 90s on death row, exhausting appeals and playing up his lone wolf narrative. He said, "The truth is, I blew up the Murrah building, and isn't it kind of scary that one man could reap this kind of hell?" Nichols, who was at home in Kansas when the bomb went off but visited OKC 3 days before to help stash McVeigh's getaway car, tried to claim he hadn't been a willing or exclusive partner. At trial, he wasn't allowed to introduce evidence that a group of white supremacists had helped McVeigh. While Nichols was acquitted of setting off the bomb in a federal trial and found guilty of conspiracy to use a weapon of mass destruction and involuntary manslaughter, the state of Oklahoma indicted him directly for the murders and found him guilty. He was given 161 life sentences. Michael Fortier got 12 years for not snitching to the feds. Because of Ruby Ridge, Waco, and a 1980s trial in which 14 white supremacists, including William Pierce, Tom Metzger, and Louis Beam, were acquitted of conspiracy and sedition in the Fort Smith sedition trial, the DOJ was unwilling to point to a broader conspiracy in the aftermath of the Oklahoma City bombing. In fact, mainstream narratives about McVeigh and the 90s omit his ties to the larger white supremacist movement.